The Obsidian flagship Eternal Dread cut through the silent void of space, leading an armada that stretched across the stars like an unending nightmare. For centuries, the Vorrath Imperium had known only conquest, their apex predator instincts turning them into the most feared civilization in the known galaxy. High Chancellor Vaelen stood at the central viewport of the bridge, his dual sets of glowing amber eyes locked onto the blue and green jewel hanging in the distance, Earth. This was a Class-9 Deathworld, a volatile planet filled with chaotic ecosystems and a primitive, unpredictable species known as humanity. Vaelen's mission, however, was not one of mere colonization. It was fueled by a cold, unrelenting vengeance that burned hotter than a dying star. Months earlier, the Imperial Crown Prince, Xylar, had vanished near this quadrant during a routine scouting mission. Every simulation run by the Imperial tacticians pointed to a grim, violent conclusion. The savage humans had undoubtedly intercepted the pod, dragged the royal heir to a hidden laboratory, and subjected him to horrific experimentation. The thought of his flesh and blood being dissected by a fragile, hairless species made Vaelen's armored mandibles click with pure fury. Behind him, thousands of shock troops stood in perfect formation, their plasma rifles humming with lethal energy, waiting for the single command that would reduce Earth's cities to ash and ruin. As the Armada breached the upper atmosphere, Earth's primitive planetary defense networks lit up with panicked emergency broadcasts. Air raid sirens wailed across continents, and military satellites frantically tried to lock onto the overwhelming alien presence, but their targeting systems were instantly jammed by the superior Vorrath technology. Vaelen ignored the weak atmospheric defenses, focusing entirely on a faint, pulsing signature glowing on his wrist gauntlet. It was his son's royal tracking beacon, emanating from a highly unexpected location, not a military bunker or a sprawling metropolis, but a quiet, nondescript suburban neighborhood. Lowering his visor, the Overlord stepped into the dropship, prepared to tear the planet apart piece by piece to rescue his heir. The peaceful afternoon in a quiet American suburb was shattered by a deafening sonic boom that rattled windows for miles. A heavy, armored Vorrath dropship slammed directly into the asphalt of a cul-de-sac, tearing up the road and sending a cloud of thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Before the dust could even settle, the mechanical bay doors hissed open, and a squad of towering, 7-foot-tall alien shock troops poured out, their heavy boots cracking the pavement. Neighbors peered through their curtains in absolute terror as the extraterrestrial soldiers bypassed the manicured lawns and advanced directly toward a modest, 2-story White House at the end of the street. High Chancellor Vaelen strode at the front of the vanguard, his heavy ceremonial cape billowing behind him as his sensor array locked onto the front door. With a flick of his wrist, 2 vanguard soldiers stepped forward and planted a localized plasma charge on the lock, vaporizing the oak wood in a brilliant flash of blue light. The troops flooded into the building with terrifying efficiency, clearing the hallway and aiming their high-caliber rifles at every shadow, expecting a desperate trap or a heavily armed human resistance group. Vaelen stepped over the smoking threshold, his heavy claws sinking into the carpet, his mind prepared to witness the worst horrors the Deathworlders had to offer. Instead of a dark, sterile torture chamber or a frantic battlefield, the alien strike team stumbled into a brightly lit, cluttered living room. The air smelled faintly of buttered popcorn and citrus detergent, a stark contrast to the sterile, metallic scent of the Imperial fleet. Sitting casually on a plush fabric sofa in the center of the room was the missing Prince Xylar himself, completely uninjured and wearing a backwards human baseball cap. Next to him sat Chloe, an ordinary teenage human girl in a baggy hoodie, who was currently yelling at a massive television screen while violently tilting a plastic gaming controller in her hands. For several agonizing seconds, the living room fell into a state of absolute, suffocating silence as the two entirely different worlds collided. The towering Vorrath shock troops remained frozen in their aggressive combat stances, their weapons aimed directly at the television and the 2 teenagers on the couch. High Chancellor Vaelen stared in utter disbelief, his advanced tactical mind completely failing to process the scene before him. His son, the heir to a galactic empire that had conquered 100 star systems, didn't look like a tormented prisoner. He looked incredibly annoyed by the sudden interruption. Left, Xylar. I told you he was flanking from the lower corridor. Chloe shouted, completely ignoring the armored aliens who had just demolished her front door. Prince Xylar furiously tapped the colorful buttons on his own controller, his reptilian eyes tracking a digital avatar across the screen before his character suddenly dissolved into virtual dust. With a heavy groan, the prince tossed the controller onto the coffee table, turned his head toward the towering warlord in the doorway, and let out a deeply exasperated sigh. Dad, seriously? You completely ruined my win streak. We were one match away from reaching the regional leaderboards. Vaelen's mandibles parted in sheer shock as he looked from his son to the small human girl, who was now casually grabbing a handful of popcorn from a plastic bowl. The fearsome Overlord raised his massive gauntlet, pointing a trembling, clawed finger at the glowing television screen and then at the backwards cap perched between Xylar's royal horns. The galaxy was on the brink of an interstellar war, millions of soldiers were awaiting the order to commit planetary genocide, and the missing prince of the Imperium was sitting on a soft human cushion, arguing about digital competitive rankings. High Chancellor Vaelen deactivated his helmet visor, his harsh, booming voice echoing off the drywall as he demanded an immediate explanation. He accused the human girl of utilizing advanced psychological warfare, suggesting that her species had implanted a deceptive neural compliance chip into the prince's brain to manipulate the Empire. The alien soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their heavy armor clanking as they awaited the order to seize the human hostage and burn the residents to the ground. Vaelen stepped forward, his massive shadow completely engulfing the couch, demanding that Xylar stand up and return to the flagship immediately so the orbital bombardment could commence. To the absolute shock of every alien in the room, Chloe did not cower, weep, or beg for mercy as expected of a supposedly fragile, non-apex species. Instead, the teenager slammed her controller down, stood up on the cushions to match the alien's height, and stepped directly between the massive Overlord and his son. Hey, first of all, you owe my parents a new front door, Chloe barked, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Vaelen's armored chestplate. Second of all, Xylar isn't going anywhere until he helps me finish this tournament, because we've been practicing for 3 straight weeks and I am not losing our ranking to some uptight space dad. Prince Xylar frantically reached up to pull Chloe back, whispering warnings about his father's legendary temper and his ability to vaporize cities with a single thought. Yet, Vaelen found himself strangely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the display. Humans were supposed to be weak, easily terrified prey, yet this young female was displaying a reckless, fiercely protective instinct that rivaled the oldest warrior clans of the Imperium. The Overlord narrowed his eyes, studying the utter lack of fear in her posture, realizing that the standard intelligence reports on human behavior were drastically flawed. Sensing that an immediate execution would only alienate his son, Vaelen decided to humiliate the human at her own primitive game to prove the biological superiority of the Vorrath mind. He commanded his troops to guard the perimeter, stepped out of his heavy ceremonial armor, and awkwardly lowered his massive, 7-foot frame onto the small, protest-groaning fabric sofa. Chloe handed him a spare wireless controller with a smirk, quickly explaining the basic layout of the thumbsticks and triggers while Xylar watched the scene unfold with an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. The next hour devolved into a bizarre display of digital warfare that completely shattered the tension of the interstellar standoff. The feared High Chancellor of the Vorrath Imperium, a master tactician who had orchestrated the downfall of entire star systems, struggled immensely to guide a cartoonish digital character through a colorful obstacle course. His giant, clawed thumbs kept smashing multiple buttons at once, causing his character to repeatedly walk off virtual cliffs while Chloe laughed uncontrollably and gave him terrible advice. Vaelen's face flushed a deep purple with frustration, his competitive pride refusing to let a teenage Deathworlder defeat him in open combat. As the matches progressed, a subtle shift occurred within the room. The alien soldiers standing guard outside the windows kept turning their heads to sneak glances at the television screen, quietly rooting for their commander. Vaelen found himself begrudgingly admiring the intricate reflexes and strategic depth required to master the human software, realizing it was a simulation of genuine tactical maneuvering. For a brief moment, the looming threat of global annihilation was entirely forgotten, replaced by the universal, unifying chaos of a split-screen video game tournament. The fragile peace of the living room was instantaneously shattered when a blinding crimson beam of light pierced through the roof, vaporizing the upper floor of the house in a split second. A massive shockwave blasted the walls outward, covering the living room in shattered drywall, splintered wood, and a suffocating layer of gray dust. Vaelen's advanced combat instincts kicked in immediately as he threw his massive body over Xylar and Chloe, shielding them from the falling structural debris as alarms began blaring from his dropped wrist communicator. Through the haze of smoke, the panicked voice of Vaelen's loyal bridge officer crackled through the static of the comms link. Chancellor, General Chryson has launched a coup. He has taken control of the orbital defense grid and is targeting your coordinates to eliminate the royal lineage. Chryson, a ruthless militarist who had long believed Vaelen was too soft on alien species, had used the distraction on the ground to seize the imperial throne, intending to blame the sudden death of the Chancellor and the Prince on a fictitious human attack. Before the dust could even clear, 3 rogue Vorrath drop pods slammed into the backyard, deploying a squad of heavily augmented elite assassins loyal to the traitorous general. The assassins advanced through the ruined kitchen, their high-energy plasma rifles humming as they fired blind into the smoke, seeking to finish off the survivors. Vaelen reached for his sidearm, only to realize his high-tech weapons had been fried by the electromagnetic pulse of the initial orbital strike, leaving him and the prince completely defenseless against the approaching execution squad. Just as the lead assassin stepped through the ruined doorway to execute the Chancellor, a sudden, deafening roar echoed from the side of the house. Chloe's father, a gruff human mechanic and a combat veteran of Earth's past resource wars, kicked through the remnants of a drywall partition holding a rusted, heavy-gauge kinetic shotgun. Without a shred of hesitation, the human pulled the trigger, unleashing a devastating blast of solid metal lead that slammed into the assassin's kinetic shielding, shattering the advanced alien technology through sheer, brute kinetic force. "Get out of my house!" The older human screamed, his eyes wide with an intense, adrenaline-fueled fury that completely stunned the elite Vorrath warriors. From the neighboring yards, other human suburban residents, armed with crude hunting rifles, heavy power tools, and volatile gasoline explosives, began pouring into the rubble, forming a chaotic but fiercely determined defensive perimeter around the alien royalty. The humans didn't possess plasma shielding or energy weapons, but their physical strength, high pain tolerance, and reckless bravery allowed them to fight with a terrifying, unpredictable ferocity. Vaelen watched in absolute awe as a human neighbor tackled a fully armored Vorrath assassin off his feet, using a blunt metal wrench to bash through the warrior's optical visor. The humans were completely outclassed technologically, yet they fought with an unbreakable, evolutionary drive to protect their territory and the people inside it. The elite alien assassins, who had spent their entire lives studying predictable energy tactics, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the raw, chaotic violence of ordinary human citizens defending a neighborhood child. The battle in the ruined ruins of the suburban home raged on as the humans utilized the terrain with ruthless efficiency. Chloe's father coordinated the neighborhood defense, using basic smoke grenades and fire extinguishers to blind the alien assassins before flanking them with heavy-caliber hunting slugs. Prince Xylar, inspired by the sheer bravery of his human caretakers, retrieved a fallen plasma blade from a disabled assassin and joined the fray, fighting side by side with Chloe to clear the remaining hostiles from the perimeter. High Chancellor Vaelen, recovering his strength, used his massive physical frame to rip a structural steel beam from the collapsing roof, swinging it like a club to crush the armor of the final traitorous infiltrator. The combined forces of human grit and imperial royalty proved to be utterly unstoppable, completely wiping out General Chryson's elite strike team within a matter of minutes. As the final assassin fell silent against the ruined pavement of the driveway, the human neighbors immediately began tending to each other's wounds, sharing water, and checking on Chloe without a single thought of self-preservation. Vaelen stood amidst the smoldering debris of the suburban household, his breath ragged as he looked at the wounded humans who had just risked their lives for him. They had no strategic reason to protect an invading alien warlord or a foreign prince, yet they had thrown themselves into the line of fire without a moment's hesitation. The Chancellor realized that the Galactic Council's classification of humanity was completely wrong. They weren't bloodthirsty monsters, nor were they weak prey. They were a species bound by an incredibly powerful, deeply terrifying sense of communal protection that extended even to outsiders who showed them respect. With the ground threat neutralized, Vaelen used a secure backup frequency to contact the Loyalist factions aboard the flagship Eternal Dread, swiftly orchestrating a counter-strike that arrested the traitorous General Chryson and restored absolute order to the Imperial fleet. The massive armada in orbit shifted its configuration, turning its weapon systems away from Earth and establishing a secure protective blockade around the planet to signal an immediate ceasefire. The looming threat of an interstellar war had completely evaporated, replaced by an aura of profound respect and mutual understanding between the two civilizations. A few hours later, a makeshift wooden folding table was set up in the middle of the ruined, roofless living room, surrounded by plastic lawn chairs provided by the next-door neighbors. High Chancellor Vaelen sat opposite Chloe's father and a hastily assembled group of local human leaders, while the holographic image of the Galactic High Council hovered above the center of the table. The alien councillors looked on in absolute astonishment as the feared warlord prepared to sign a comprehensive, historically unprecedented peace treaty next to a stack of stained paper plates and a cooler of lemonade. The Vorrath Imperium hereby recognizes the sovereignty of Earth and its inhabitants, Vaelen announced, his voice carrying a deep, resonant tone of genuine respect as he pressed his royal seal onto the digital document. Our intelligence reports failed to capture the true nature of your species. We studied your historical wars, but we entirely failed to understand the strength of your hearts. Any civilization that fights with such fierce, protective devotion for a guest is a civilization worthy of our highest alliance. As the Imperial dropships began loading the remaining shock troops to return to the fleet, High Chancellor Vaelen walked alongside his son through the ruined driveway. The Overlord turned to the young prince, his amber eyes narrowing slightly as he asked the final, lingering question that had bothered him since his arrival. Xylar, your escape pod's long-range tracking system was fully functional the entire time you were here. Why did you never send a distress signal to let the Empire know you were alive? The young prince paused, looking back at the ruined house where Chloe and her father were already laughing and discussing how to rebuild the living room to fit a larger television. Xylar smiled softly, pulling his backwards baseball cap further down over his royal horns as he looked his father dead in the eye. Because for my entire life, I was groomed to be a cold, ruthless conqueror for the court, and I never knew what it felt like to just be a kid until a human girl shared her snacks and taught me how to play a game. Earth wasn't my prison, Dad. It was the only place in the galaxy where I finally felt like I belonged. Vaelen stared at his son for a long moment, realizing that the death world had not broken the prince. It had given him a sense of empathy and strength that would make him the greatest ruler the Imperium had ever seen. The Chancellor patted Xylar's shoulder, turned toward the dropship, and granted him permission to remain on Earth as the Empire's official cultural ambassador. Weeks later, the first interspecies gaming tournament was broadcasted across the stars, proving to the entire galaxy that the greatest victories weren't won through planetary warfare, but through shared understanding and an unbreakable bond formed in a quiet human neighborhood. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.